The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of History Nebraska. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in the Nebraska History magazine. On this episode, we look back at an article written in 1977 by John Kyle Davis. Today, let's look back at the history of the Gray Wolf, Tom Dennison of Omaha. Of the many individuals whose contributions have formed the history of Omaha, few have had as strong and lasting influence as Tom Dennison. During the nearly 40 years he spent as boss of the city's 3rd Ward, his power was felt not only in Omaha, but to some extent throughout Nebraska. Yet, today Dennison remains a shadowy and enigmatic figure, cloaked by legend and hearsay. Thomas Dennison was born near Delhi, Iowa on October 26, 1858, the third of 8 children of Irish immigrants John and Anna Dennison. In 1860, the Dennisons moved to a farm near Franklin, now Jackson, in Dakota City, Nebraska. Rich soil and a high percentage of Irish-born residents in the area attracted the elder Dennison, who remained there the rest of his life. During that time, he took an active part in the life of his community, owning a modest but successful farm and serving in several minor elective posts. Beyond this, little is known of the Dennison family or of Tom until he left home at the age of 15 and returned to Iowa. Following his departure from home in 1873, Dennison spent 6 years as a farm laborer in Montana and Mills counties. There, he once won a county cornhusking championship, an accomplishment that he later would recall with great pride. In 1879, Dennison left Iowa and sought adventuring farther west. He worked at blacksmithing in Kansas, prospecting in Colorado, and railroading in New Mexico. While living at the Kokomo, Colorado mining camp, he allegedly shot and wounded a man. He then moved to Leadville and became a floor walker at the Texas, the town's largest and most notorious gambling hell. During this period, Dennison showed a knack for taking advantage of business opportunities, and within a short time rose from bouncer to owner of a quarter interest in the Texas. He then sold it, using his profits to purchase part ownership in Leadville's Opera House. With Charlie Pearson as a partner, he started the Old Arcade in Denver, the first of a chain of gambling houses left in his wake as he coursed the Rocky Mountain area. In 1892, he settled in Omaha after having briefly visited the city 2 years earlier. 34 years of flamboyant frontier living had created in Dennison an imposing figure. Standing 6 feet tall with 200 pounds proportionately spread over a large bone frame, immaculately dressed and usually wearing large, flawless diamonds, Dennison reflected power. Though he was taciturn and impassive by nature, his emotions were expressed on occasion by hearty laughter or angry outbursts. Photographs of Dennison show a man with cold, penetrating eyes who often had a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had a deep voice, flawed by a slight impediment noticeable only during infrequent bursts of tenseness. There has been some speculation as to why Tom Dennison decided to settle in Omaha. Former Harper's editor George Layton believed Dennison came as a representative of a gambling syndicate to consolidate vice activities. The editor gave no documentation to support his claim, and no evidence appears to exist which could lend credence to his statement. By the 1890s, Omaha had reached the peak of an economic boom which transformed it from a small river town into the leading agricultural, railroad, and meatpacking centers of the Midwest. Grain production for the country tributary to Omaha in 1889 was valued at $181,642,000. 10 railroads passed through the city, and the Union Stockyards, non-existent in 1880, had made South Omaha the 3rd largest packing center in the country. The 1890 population of 102,430, an increase of 233% over a decade, also reflected the boom. Even the economic slump of the 1890s failed to completely dampen the confidence of many Omahans. However, the city had a seamy side not mentioned in the booster pamphlets of the period. This activity was centered in the Third Ward and was responsible for the city being called the, quote, wickedest city in the United States, end quote, and a wide open town. The Third Ward, sandwiched between the Missouri River and the commercial retail district, gained notoriety through its saloons, its gambling dens, street games, and brothels. Drifters, swindlers, gamblers, prostitutes, and criminals comprised a significant segment of its population, though exact figures are not readily available. The police, with the exception of rare, obligatory crackdowns, generally ignored the district's activities. City fathers often looked upon the area as a necessary evil. The Slocum Law, enacted by the state legislature in 1881 to control saloons, was mainly disregarded, as were the various laws and ordinances which attempted to regulate gambling and prostitution. As goes the Third Ward, so goes the city, referred to the substantial majorities it gave to machine candidates, an advantage other candidates were often unable to surmount with majorities from other precincts in the city. Dennison came into this setting to build on previously laid foundations. He only needed to further consolidate and organize the ward and its sundry activities under his control to make himself supreme. From April until November of 1892, Dennison appeared to have no source of income nor any desire to find one, spending most of his time in the lobby of a hotel where he lived or in Joe Sonnenberg's pawn shop. After November, though, he became a whirlwind of activity. He first established a gambling house in an alley near 14th and Dodge, from which he ran a policy game, an illegal form of lottery popular among low-income classes. The game provided profitable for the gambler, which within a few years he and his brother John had opened branch shops in South Omaha and across state lines in East Omaha, Iowa. Near the turn of the century, these three dens formed the most successful enterprises of their kind in the city. During this period, Dennison formed connections, often through silent partnerships, with other saloon casinos. The Denver, owned by Dennison's old Colorado partner Charlie Pearson, and managed by Tom's brother Patrick. The Diamond, also run by Pat, and a place called Cliff Cole's. Eventually, Cole's Saloon was bought by Billy Nesselhaus, who had Dennison's backing and was renamed the Budweiser. It served for many years as Dennison's headquarters. In the early 1890s, the Third Ward had been controlled by a group known as the Big Four: Charles D. Bibbins, Hiram B. Kennedy, Charles White, and Jack Morrison. When they suddenly and mysteriously left town following a routine police crackdown, a power vacuum was created in the district. Dennison took advantage of it to further establish his power. He became the new middleman between saloon owners and gamblers on one hand, and police and key politicians on the other. Helping to cement this relationship was the appointment of Dennison's brother-in-law, James Wilson, to the police force in 1898. Wilson's beat was the Third Ward. Such was the growing strength of Dennison's connections that by the late 1890s, both Police Chief Martin White and Mayor Frank Moores gained tainted reputations by allegations that they were the gamblers' allies. They were not the last high officials so charged. Dennison used his growing influence to solidify his hold on the Third Ward, an operation in which police officials proved valuable Confederates. A prominent attorney, Richard Cohen, wondered why many small saloons were closed by the police, often for minor violations, while Dennison's gambling concern was allowed to operate in definite violation of the law within just a few blocks of the police station. The World Herald suggested that Police Chief White's policy seems to have been to drive all of the gambling business into the hands of Tom Dennison. At least one owner found his saloon gambling hall closed by the police because of, quote, fear that a smallpox epidemic had broken out there, end quote. The owner had announced he would not be subject to Dennison's wishes when he opened his doors for business a few days previously. In 1907, during a libel suit involving Dennison and the Daily News, a former employee of the Gamblers testified as to some of his methods. Several years before, Vic Walker was given a sum of money by Dennison and told to buy out the owner of the Midway, a man who the gambler felt had crossed him. Walker did so and became a trusted lieutenant until 1901. In that year, he testified he refused to follow one of Dennison's orders, and he was beaten up in the presence of the ward boss and a policeman. Walker, soon afterward, left town. In January 1899, a campaign against vice by the World Herald pointed to Dennison, and raids were made on his policy shops by Deputy Sheriff Henry S. McDonald, acting in concert with the county attorney. The World Herald gleefully recorded the events while chastising Mayor Moores and Police Chief White for failing to do their duty. But it was soon discovered that the gambler's powers had reached the point where any action taken against him caused an inevitable reaction. Through orders issued by Moores, pressure was placed on the saloon keepers and wholesale liquor dealer Walter Moyse, a prominent businessman, to use their influence to have the charges against Dennison dropped. To a certain extent, the plan worked. A reporter summed up one owner's concern when the latter was asked why he didn't resist, quote, "The trouble is that the saloon keepers have been laying themselves liable by infringements upon the Slocum law, and they're not in a condition to make a fight upon anyone. And it's not Dennison they are afraid of so much as some of the men who are acknowledged to be behind him. Then there is the mayor and the fire and police commission, and finally the chief of police. No saloon keeper can afford to fight them," end quote. However, the influential Moyse refused to be intimidated and was threatened with the revocation of his license. The dealer stood firm and was saved from further harassment by a restraining order placed on Morse and White. A year after his arrest, though, a court ordered all charges against Dennison dropped on a legal technicality. By the early 1900s, Dennison had established his ward machine. A key lieutenant, Billy Nesselhouse, became the business brains of the organization and coordinated various vice activities from the Budweiser. Nesselhouse, a former jockey and coal hauler, made his start in Omaha as a street gambler. In many respects, he was the opposite of Dennison, though their differences actually complemented each other. Small and bespectacled, Nesselhouse enjoyed the company of beautiful women and a fast nightlife. A friend of actresses, prostitutes, con men, professional men, and businessmen, he was more able to adapt himself to different types of people than was Dennison. He provided the boss valuable connections with the more influential elements of the community and was willing to be the scapegoat when things went wrong. There were other key members of the organization, including black men and members of other racial and ethnic groups. Prior to World War I, the city was less intolerant towards some minority groups. Dennison, recognizing the importance of minority support, made sure these groups had representatives within the machine. For instance, he financed the previously mentioned Vic Walker, a black man, in the purchase of the Midway, a resort in the heart of the red light district. In return for police protection, Walker was placed in charge of the district and acted as liaison between the black community and the boss. When Walker and Dennison disagreed following an argument during the elections of 1901, the lieutenant was replaced by Jack Broomfield, another black man. He was to be a loyal subordinate for many years. As the machine rose in power, there was a corresponding increase in vice. Both anti-Dennison newspapers frequently were aroused by the situation. The Daily News commented, quote, "Liberal government is fine for thugs and lawbreakers. How do you like it?" End quote. And the World Herald editorialized, quote, "The policy of our police department is bearing legitimate fruit. A gang of desperados has been encouraged to make Omaha a haven and a refuge and has been educating a lot of young men in the ways of crime. This doctrine that was permitted to live in Omaha, they commit all their misdeeds outside the city, is almost as false as it is immoral," end quote. Among the rogues frequently reported to be in the city were the John C. Mabry gang, a group of Iowa swindlers, Patrick Crow, train robber and kidnapper, and Fainting Bertha Libke, whose gambit was swooning in front of her unsuspecting victims and then picking their pockets when they came to her aid. Gambling, although outlawed, became stronger than ever, and the number of saloons grew. Between 1905 and 1915, Omaha had the greatest increase in drinking establishments of any city in the nation. Attempts to control public drinking, mainly through the 8 p.m. closing law passed in 1908, were, like the Slocum Law, mainly ineffective. The greatest increase of all, however, came in the area of prostitution. By 1910, there were an estimated 100 brothels and 2,500 prostitutes in the city. It was estimated that from 1905 to 1911, the average yearly income from the houses, including their accompanying liquor business, was $17,760,000. As long as the bordello owners maintained amicable relations with the administration and saw that their inmates regularly visited the doctor, the police made little attempt to enforce the prostitution statutes. Even the closing of M.F. Martin's Arcade, literally a small village of 132 brick and tar paper cribs covering 4 blocks, and the passage by the state legislature of the tough Albert Law, had little effect upon prostitution. On the same day in 1914 that a grand jury reported finding no examples of harlotry in the city, a streetwalker was quoted by the Daily News as saying, quote, "It's a poor girl on the street who can't make at least $5 a night in Omaha," end quote. As Dennison's control of vice increased, he sensed he needed more than support of a few police and city officials in order to remain in business. The 1899 raid on his shops, handled completely by county agents, emphasized this need. Thus, by 1900, the policy king began to take a more active part in politics. Dennison has been described as both a Republican and a Democrat. In fact, he was neither, but was apolitical, preferring to back the party or candidates who could serve his needs best. He originally worked within a local Republican group, but before his career was over, he had supported several Democrats. In the late 1890s, Dennison associated himself with the local Republican machine controlled by Edward Rosewater and his newspaper, the Omaha Bee. A feisty bohemian immigrant, Rosewater had built his newspaper from a small political flyer into one of the most prestigious papers in the Midwest, and he had built a reputation as a man who would fight rival editors both physically and verbally. Throughout the latter part of his life, Rosewater aspired to be a U.S. Senator. He failed twice, in 1901 and in 1906, to achieve this goal because he lacked statewide support in the legislature, which at that time elected the senators. Nevertheless, during this period, he was able to gain control of a large faction of the local Republican Party. When and how the gambler and the editor formed their alliance is not known. There were reports of the two men being connected in the late 1890s, but it was not until the early 1900s that the Daily News and the World Herald started referring to a Rosewater-Dennison machine. Dennison first appeared to exert some authority in the fall elections of 1900, openly campaigning for the re-election of Congressman David Mercer. Mercer had allegedly been useful politically to Dennison. That election was followed by one the next year, which was even more essential to his bid for political control. The autumn election of 1901 had been called one of the hardest fought in Omaha history. This was particularly true in the race for county judge. The incumbent, Duncan M. Vinsohaler, had alienated both Dennison and Rosewater during his previous term. The judge, ironically a staunch Republican, had refused to support the editor in his bid for a Senate seat, and he had issued warrants against Dennison and his policy game. Rosewater, in retaliation, began a series of editorial attacks which aroused much comment. The Journal at Lincoln said, quote, "Rosewater is so far ahead of the World Herald in the intensity of his opposition to Judge Vinsohaler that he is dissatisfied with the mildness of its criticisms of that Republican official," end quote. The Omaha Daily News claimed that although, quote, "it appears Rosewater is supporting Vinsohaler, he is against him," end quote, and that Dennison was helping the newspaperman behind the scenes by the use of fraudulent election tactics. A third paper, the Weekly Examiner, contended that, quote, "Rosewater's function in the election seemed to have been that of furnishing ammunition to the opposition," end quote. It also suggested that Tom Dennison stay out of politics lest he receive the same fate as the Big Four. Allegedly, these 4 gamblers who controlled the Third Ward vice and politics in the early 1890s had been forced to leave town when they tried to spread their political influence. Despite Rosewater's editorializing and Dennison's efforts, Vincenholler won by gaining majorities in all areas except the Dennison strongholds and South Omaha. However, in subsequent elections, Third Ward forces were often the deciding factor, and until 1918, Dennison was a strong influence in both city and county elections and appointments. Although the boss never gained a foothold in the important office of county attorney, he was believed to have gained entry into other areas. At times, between 1901 and 1918, office holders in the judiciary, Congress, and Omaha City Council, later the Commission, and the fire and police departments were linked with Dennison. There were even attempts at one time to tie in reform-oriented Governor George L. Sheldon with Dennison. Charges of fraudulent practices in connection with Third Ward elections became more common. Included among the accusations were ballot box stuffing, false registrations, the use of illegal voters, and intimidation. Even minority and majority reports of the state legislature committee investigating these malpractices totally agree that they existed. Their only difference of opinion was the extent to which they carried out. Strangely, despite his increase in political power, both the Daily News and the World Herald regarded Dennison as being politically dead between 1905 and 1910, although they still acknowledged his control of vice in the city. There were several reasons why the papers developed this inaccurate attitude at the time the Ward boss was actually reaching his zenith politically. In 1904, Dennison was indicted for a jewel robbery which occurred 12 years previously on a train outside Missouri Valley, Iowa, and resulted in the loss of $15,000 in diamonds. Shortly afterwards, a man known as Frank Shercliffe, born Sherman Morris, was convicted of the crime. After his release from the Iowa penitentiary, Shercliffe announced that he had committed the crime, but that Tom Dennison had been the mastermind. Based on Shercliffe's declaration, Dennison was charged with complicity in the crime. Dennison failed in his attempt to prevent extradition to Iowa, and the trial began in Red Oak, Iowa, in 1905. The case against Dennison appeared strong. The gambler had known Shercliffe in his Utah days. The two men were seen talking in Sonnenberg's pawn shop the day before the robbery. Shortly after the robbery, Dennison suddenly had enough money to open his policy shop. Letters and ledgers, believed to be in Dennison's handwriting, indicated that he had gone to great lengths, including his use of several politicians, to gain the robber's pardon. And for a brief period after Shercliffe's release, the ex-convict lived in the Dennison home. Opponents of Dennison were wrong in their assumption that the trial would result in a prison sentence for him. The prosecution's case was based almost solely upon the testimony of Frank Shercliffe, a letter written by Dennison to Homer Morris, Shercliffe's brother, and an 1892 Iowa hotel register which bore the name Tom Dennison. This last evidence was used to show that the gambler had met with the robber 5 days after the crime. The most that could be proved was that Dennison had known Shercliffe, had talked to him prior to the robbery, had provided money for his defense, and had worked to secure his pardon. The defense, led by prominent attorney W.J. Connell, contended that Dennison was framed. The lawyer argued that a group of men headed by lawyer Elmer E. Thomas, the Jewelers Protective Association, and the Anti-Dennison Civic Federation had bought Shercliffe. Most of the defense centered upon impeaching his testimony and showing Dennison's high standing in Omaha. Several prominent businessmen and politicians, including Mayor Morse and the Chief of Police John Donahue, Martin White's successor, testified to Dennison's good character. Furthermore, an incident which occurred 6 months prior to the trial had left some people wondering to what extent Dennison's foes would go to rid the city of him. In November of 1904, the home of Elmer Thomas had been damaged by a dynamite bomb. Thomas had been a bitter foe of the gamblers since the late 1890s and had been instrumental in bringing Dennison to trial. Stimulated by news stories in the Daily News and World Herald and manipulated by Thomas himself, public opinion first condemned Dennison's forces for the bombing. It was thought by many people that Thomas needed to be kept quiet by the machine, either through death or fear, depending on how people wished to interpret the intent of the bombing. Opinion shifted, however, as doubts arose about the incident and incongruities were noted. Some persons began to wonder if the bomb might not have been planted by Thomas sympathizers in an effort to discredit Dennison, and if the tactics of those who opposed Dennison were not as unscrupulous as those of the boss. The incident may have still been in the minds of some of the jurors, or they may have felt the evidence against him was too circumstantial. Dennison was acquitted, but the indictment and trial appeared to constitute a costly blow to his forces. The year after Dennison's acquittal, 1906, Mayor Frank Moores and editor Edward Rosewater both died. Rosewater's son and successor, Victor, inherited a strong role in Republican politics and continued the B policy of rarely mentioning Dennison's name in print. Although attempts were made to associate Dennison with Victor Rosewater, they usually proved fruitless. Furthermore, W.J. Broach, the machine candidate to replace Moores as mayor, lost his bid for the Republican nomination to that office. Thus, it appeared that part of Dennison's power base had disappeared. In truth, it only had shifted. Dennison's pretended retreat into the shadows of Omaha politics, while he actually gained strength, was accompanied by a decrease in negative publicity of the two anti-Dennison newspapers. Starting with the defeat of Broach and the subsequent 1906 city elections, Democratic candidates backed by the World Herald, the News, and anti-machine Republicans began to gain more elective posts. For the two newspapers to have continued their allegations of corruption in the city administration would have been damaging to apparently unsullied men who were supported by the two dailies. In continuing to attack only Vice and the police department, both papers were guilty of believing or pretending to believe that only Rosewater Republicans could be Dennison's allies. Nepotism by Dennison-backed men administering crucial offices eventually became commonplace in both city and county government. In 1904, John Dennison was appointed sidewalk inspector, and 8 years later, his brother Pat took the coveted post of street department foreman. Within a few more years, Pat's son became a police officer, and Billy Nesselhouse's stepbrother, a city commissioner. In 1909, Louis Burmeister, a Third Ward saloon keeper and ally of Dennison's, was selected president of the city council. The following year, Johnny Lynch, boss of the 10th Ward and Dennison's most important ally next to Nesselhouse, was elected to the county commission and shortly thereafter became chairman. Lynch's election was important to Dennison. First, it gave him a powerful connection in county government. Second, it gave him control over grand and petite juries. Within a few years, an unusually high number of names on the annual jury list were issued by Lynch were drawn from the 3rd and 10th Wards, and the same names appeared again on subsequent lists. The importance of jury tampering cannot be underestimated. It helped to keep many of Dennison's activities thriving. For example, in January 1912, the sheriff raided the Midway and arrested its owner, Dennison crony Jack Broomfield. The World Herald praised the sheriff for eliminating, quote, the most vicious joints to be found in this or any other city, end quote, and chastised the police for having allowed it to operate. Broomfield's 4 trials were held in county court, and all of them ended in hung juries. During one trial, a juror failed to show up, and a replacement was found in the crowd. By the sheerest of coincidences, the substitute, who was the only member to vote for acquittal, lived in the same house as Johnny Lynch. After a grand jury ordered the case moved to district court, 2 more trials ended in deadlock, and an exasperated judge ordered the case dismissed. Besides his gains in political and judicial influence, strong relations developed between Dennison and elements of the business community. Saloon keepers and brothel owners were required to buy merchandise from specified departments and furniture stores, liquor dealers, breweries, groceries, dairies, and coal yards. Important city contracts for paving, building, printing, and city supplies also went to favored businesses. Even more important were the connections between the Dennison clique and the public service corporations. private companies which supplied public transportation, gas, water, and electricity through franchises granted by the city. At least 2 of these franchises were controlled by large Eastern companies who, as absentee landlords, needed a strong local business agent. Even those locally controlled found the boss useful. Court cases involving the corporations were common, and sympathetic judges and juries were needed. Franchises periodically were renewed and reviewed by city councilmen favorable to the machine were needed. Demands by users for better service and lower rates were continually being made, but were postponed with the covenants of elected officials. Among the character witnesses who had testified at Dennison's trial in 1905 were 2 employees of the utility companies. His defense attorney in that and future court cases was William J. Connell, who served for 30 years as a lawyer for service corporations in the city and for the Omaha Bee. At the city council meeting in 1905, Mayor Morse and the pro-corporation element forced the rest of the council to accept a new gas street lighting contract. 4 policemen refused to allow spectators to enter or leave the chamber during the, quote, debate. The World Herald believed the contract was not the vital issue, although it meant more profit for the gas company. It compared Moore's machinations to those of the South American dictatorship. Not until 7 years later was a more reasonable contract worked out. The Dennison forces aided the service corporations in their fight against a trend towards municipal ownership of public utilities. In June of 1911, a bond issue faced Omaha's electorate, and its passage, assuring the purchase of the waterworks by the city, seemed inevitable, climaxing a 10-year struggle by the reformists. Instead, the bond issue was defeated by a narrow margin when the reformists failed by 100 votes to get the 2/3 majority needed. The Bee first editorialized that the defeat was due to the, quote, gradual awakening of the people to the enormity of the bunco game that the reformers had been playing, end quote, and later blamed public apathy. However, there were more significant reasons for the defeat. The bonds had passed by wide margins in all the wards but 2, the Dennison-controlled 3rd and 10th wards, where the results showed an 80% anti-bond vote. In the 2nd precinct of the 3rd ward, which voted 349 to 5 against the bonds, and 354 ballots were cast, were a greater number than the totals of the entire 1st, 4th, and 8th wards. Although the bonds eventually passed a few months later, the election pointed up the relationship between Dennison's organization and private business. In 1906, Dennison found an ally in James C. Cowboy Jim Dalman, a Texan recently arriving from Chadron, where he had been sheriff and mayor. His 20-plus years in office eventually earned him the nickname the Perpetual Mayor of Omaha. Flamboyant and colorful, Dalman reflected a grassroots hominess in his attitudes which endeared him to many citizens, particularly to Tom Dennison. Ironically, Democrat Dalman was supported by the World Herald and at least tolerated by the Daily News during most of his political career in Omaha. The exact Dalman-Dennison relationship is not entirely clear, even today. The mayor was not Dennison's tool in the sense that some politicians were. There is even evidence that during Dalman's first election campaign in 1906, the Dennison organization worked against him. In later years, Dennison stated that he had always supported the mayor. Nor did the Texans' friendship with Dennison lead him into venality. Following Dalman's death in 1930, the boss said of him, quote, I have known the mayor for 30 years, and I have never knew him to do a dishonorable act or make a mistake. He was conscientiously honest. He was never for sale. I never asked Dalman to do a thing that was wrong, end quote. This is one of the few instances where statements directly attributed to Dennison can be taken without question. Even Dalman's strongest critics have agreed that the mayor was personally an honest man, supported by Dennison because of his administrative qualifications. Dalman was elected mayor in 1906 as a moderate reformer, but by no means a moral crusader. In regard to saloons, gambling, and prostitution, the mayor adopted a hands-off policy. The mayor and many other Omahans saw no problem as long as these vices remained isolated in the 3rd ward. Although Dalman was an advocate of municipally owned utilities during the campaign of 1906, he was slow in using his influence to obtain reform. The waterworks did not become a municipal corporation until 1912 and the gasworks not until 1920s. Thus, Dalman proved satisfactory to the machine and its businessmen supporters because he was not a disturber. Dalman's philosophy was described in these words by one contemporary, quote, "Toward big business and organized vice, he had adapted a laissez-faire policy. Rather, he had allowed businesses' interests to have what they wanted and has hoaxed some of the people into believing that the public got what it wanted." End quote. With the support of business and an amiable mayor, Dennison reached his peak of power in 1914. However, over the next 4 years, a series of adversities struck the boss and his organization. During 1914, the Daily News started a series of attacks on Johnny Lynch. Often resorting to sensational tactics, the newspaper brought out the irregularities in jury lists and private detectives that were hired to investigate the county government. Lynch declared that one of the detectives, using a false identity, had tried to trap him with an offer of a bribe. The commissioner, by his own account, refused it. The feud between Lynch and the News became so heated that when a reporter, Charles Driscoll, was beaten by thugs, there was suspicion that the commissioner may have been responsible. Even more damage to Lynch was the mysterious murder of 3 men, including a former councilman, in July of 1914, since Lynch's brother, Humphrey, had been seen arguing with 2 of the victims shortly before their murders. Furthermore, the same 2 men were rumored to be enemies of Lynch. Adding to the mystery was the statement that the wife of one of the victims was told by police not to discuss the murders. No connections were ever proved, but the police and the Lynches were regarded with suspicion by the News. A month after the crime, Humphrey was fired from his job as county plumber. With his name frequently connected with such activities, Lynch became a political liability to Tom Dennison. More seriously, by late 1916 and early 1917, Humphrey had become an untrustworthy lieutenant. During the winter, Lynch attempted to unseat his leader as city boss. An investigation into county government brought allegations of malfeasance in office under Lynch and resulted in ouster suit being brought against him. Much of the interest centered around a room in the courthouse, ostensibly used as the gymnasium, but alleged to be the site of soirees planned by Lynch. Whether or not this investigation was ordered by Dennison is unknown, but in the resulting ouster trial, one of the key witnesses against Lynch was Tom Dennison. In his testimony, he freely told of various vice activities in which he and the commissioner had been involved. Lynch was forced from office and soon after left town, but in the process, Dennison had admitted to many shady dealings which he had previously denied. Other factors damaged the Dennison organization. First, a strong registration and election law passed by the state legislature in 1915 put a crimp in 2 of the machine's election tricks: fraudulent registration and repeat voting. Second, during World War I, the 3rd Ward Vice District was declared off-limits to servicemen from nearby military installations. This, and the entry of many young Omahans into the armed services, curtailed a potent source of revenue for the organization. Compounding this problem was the passage of a state prohibition law which forced the saloons and gambling dens underground. Third, and the most damaging of all, was the 1918 city election in which 5 of the 7 city commissioners, including Mayor Dalman, were voted out of office. A strong reform movement appeared to be responsible for the change in city government. Capitalizing on the prohibition movement, the scandal in county government, the revelation of corrupt practices in the police department, and the letting of city contracts, the reformists rode a public backlash into victory. It was the most serious defeat in Dennison's career. Hampered severely by the new election law, his candidates lost at the polls. The Daily News was elated at the results. Quote, "The electorate's action is a millpost in the city's history. It does not pay to let the vice interests run their tentacles into the city hall, nor permit corporation influences to have a hand in the management of our affairs. The people picked the right men to inaugurate the new regime." End quote. In the weeks following the victory, it seemed that a new era was starting for Omaha. Edward P. Smith, a successful lawyer, was chosen by his fellow commissioners to be the new mayor. John Ringer was selected police commissioner and was given the inevitable task of cleansing the police department and putting a tight rein on the city's vice. After having made those admirable appointments, the reformers agreed on little else. The term reformer in Omaha was a misnomer and suggested a unity which was never present among the commissioners. The 5 newly elected men and the 2 incumbents ranged from moderate progressives like Smith to radicals like Ringer, who saw his election as a call for a moral crusade. Unable to agree on the methods of carrying out the reforms, the 7 officials began to fight amongst themselves. Furthermore, conditions in the police department did not improve in spite of Ringer's hopes. Early in 1919, it was disclosed that several policemen were involved in an auto theft ring. While serious misfortune plagued the department, Ringer pursued such quixotic ideas as an automated gate on the Douglas Street Bridge to catch bootleggers. The most damaging blow to the Reform administration was the courthouse riot in September 1919, a year of unrest in Omaha. Aside from problems within City Hall and the police department, the community was feeling the effects of social unrest. Servicemen returning from the war were unable to find jobs. Inflation was high. Labor was restless, and Omaha was threatened by a series of strikes. Although strikes were averted, rumor had it that should they occur, black men would be brought in as strikebreakers. These stories enraged many Omahans who already believed that the growing black population was a problem of major concern. Omaha newspapers, particularly the Bee and the Daily News, had filled the first 9 months with inflammatory stories of local crimes committed by blacks, including alleged attacks upon white women. It did not matter that many of these, quote, attacks proved to be unfounded or grossly exaggerated. On the night of September 25th, a young woman, Agnes Lobeck, and her escort, Milton Hoffman, were accosted by a man. Hoffman, a cripple, was robbed, and Miss Lobeck allegedly raped. Will Brown, a black man, was arrested and charged with the crime and lodged in Douglas County Jail on the 3rd floor of the courthouse. On September 28th, he was taken from the jail by a mob, shot, hanged, and burned. The courthouse sustained an estimated $1 million in fire damage during the raid. Mayor Smith, who tried to stall the vigilantes, was strung up for his trouble. 2 officials rescued him before he was strangled. 2 other men were killed. 50 were injured in the melee. It cannot be proven what part, if any, the Dennison organization played in the disorder. Tom himself was out of town during that period. However, the riot was a boon to that group and a bane for an already shaky city administration. The next 19 months saw the reformists become completely ineffective. In the city elections of 1921, Dennison-supported candidates led by Dalman were returned to City Hall. During the 1920s, Dennison's power reemerged as strong as it had ever been between 1905 to 1914. His control of the police department was such that a policeman acting as a liaison could often be found at Dennison's headquarters in the Carbach building, while other officers acted as his personal chauffeurs. In elections, the organization was dominant, though the days of extreme fraud had passed. Dennison candidates no longer won by gaining unbelievable majorities in the 3rd Ward, but they continued to win until 1933. The city's vice activities produced as much revenue as ever. Drinking and gambling, forced underground by the 18th Amendment and reformist attitudes, were never far from the surface. Speakeasies were not hard to find, and roadhouses lined the outskirts of the city. Opposition to Dennison and the City Hall gang began to take a different tone. The Daily News continued its opposition even after its merger with the Bee in 1927, but it began to treat the organization as a political anachronism. The World Herald had stopped its vehement attacks upon the boss and treated him with more moderation. Still concerned with good city government and an honest police department, the paper also began to regard Dennison as the last of a fast-dying breed. Legends about Dennison emerged. He was spoken of as a man who was true to his friends, a man of his word, and a kind benefactor who would use his own money to help a down and outer or a family in need. The story was told of how he once sent an asthmatic ward healer to Arizona to recover his health. Allegedly, the man never found out who his benefactor was. To some supporters, Dennison even became known affectionately as the Old Man. To a certain extent, the boss had changed, although he continued to be the kingpin through the 1920s and into the 1930s. Much of his interest in politics waned. On occasion, he stated that he had never really loved politics, but he had been forced into it to protect his gambling interests and had often thought of retiring completely. Work and responsibilities were delegated to underlings, while Dennison spent more time racing horses and raising wire-haired terriers at his country home near 72nd and Military. The death of his wife, Ada, in 1922 affected Dennison immensely. She had been one of the few people for whom he had strong personal feelings, and he had worked hard to protect her from the seamy aspects of his life. After her death, he began to devote more time to his only surviving child, Francis, and to his 2 grandsons. Still, Dennison remained to his foes the Gray Wolf, who was, in the words of one longtime newspaperman, quote, not a very nice man, end quote. In the late winter of 1932, Dennison and 58 other persons were charged by a federal grand jury with conspiracy to violate the prohibition laws. Among those indicted were Billy Nesselhouse, 3 prominent policemen, and a city prosecutor. The charges had been the result of investigations by federal agents. The trial began in October of 1932 with the prosecution facing a formidable task, proving that the defendants were involved in a conspiracy led by Dennison was difficult, even though there was strong evidence of illegal liquor traffic, police department cooperation, and the use of gangland tactics to discourage opposition. Other charges were weak. Attempts to tie the alleged syndicate to the murder of Harry Lapidus, a civic crusader, were based almost exclusively on hearsay and the testimony of Tom Crawford, a former policeman and Dennison's supporter. Both prosecution and defense agreed it would be hard to prove. Even weaker was the attempt to prove that Dennison had met with Al Capone in Chicago to study the underworld figure's organization and tactics. The defense quickly pointed out that at the time of the supposed meeting, Capone was serving a prison sentence in Philadelphia. By December, the charges against 43 of the men, most of the minor figures, had been dropped. The trial had a noticeable physical effect upon Dennison. A New York Times reporter described the aging boss as, quote, hard-boiled, sophisticated, and palsied old man racked by a long series of illnesses from which he has not yet recovered, end quote. These lingering effects, the strain of the trial, and concern over his grandson's emergency surgery, which resulted in an all-night vigil for him, proved too much even for Dennison's physical toughness, and near the trial's end, he collapsed. His weakened condition led to pneumonia, and he lingered near death for several days before recovering. By December 13th, after the jury was unable to reach a decision, a mistrial was declared. Most of the jurors had voted for conviction, believing that a conspiracy had existed. However, the testimony of key witness Tom Crawford was questioned by some jurors. Having been booted from Dennison's organization, Crawford's statements to the jurors has seemed colored with malice. The government promised a second trial, but finally dropped all charges against Dennison in April of 1933. It did not really matter. A Times reporter believed the real purpose of the trial was to break Dennison's political power. If so, it succeeded. The old man was ill. His reputation had been blackened by trial publicity, and he had lost a valuable political ally in the death of Mayor Dalman in 1930. The city elections of 1933 saw a near sweep by the anti-Dennison Independent Voters League. The night before the election, League campaign workers had sung, "The old gray wolf, he ain't what he used to be," and the number was carried in one of Omaha's first remote radio broadcasts. Dennison went on to San Diego, California to visit friends and to recuperate from his illness. On January 27, 1934, he was injured when an automobile in which he was a passenger was involved in an accident. He died on February 14th following a cerebral hemorrhage. When Dennison was buried at Forest Lawn in Omaha, the funeral attracted more than 1,000 people, including most of the city's prominent political, judicial, and police officials. Among the telegrams of condolence was one from Tom Pendergast, a czar of the Kansas City Machine. Lifelong foes of Dennison spoke of him with grudging admiration, for he had been a fascinating man. Perhaps the reason for the fascination was best summed up by the World Herald. Quote, There were quite the makings of another sort of man in Tom Dennison. He had courage. He had the qualities of natural leadership, of the fighter, and he was industrious and persevering. Suppose he had been directed into a better path for a better end, our guess is that he would have gone far and won for himself a deservedly honored name. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about the Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcasts, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of History Nebraska, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. Until next time, for History Nebraska, I'm Chris Goforth.